Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2023 Johns Hopkins Carey Business School's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Summit. We're so glad you all are here and are very excited to have you join us in the exploration of the theme of belonging in action. Before I begin, I share a land and labor acknowledgement. I acknowledge the forceful displacement of indigenous people and the privilege I have of being able to access education in the US because of this. I pay tribute to the contributions of Black and Brown people who have constructed and maintained this nation and its educational institutions, allowing me to access these spaces. Furthermore, I understand that technology, which is a product of colonization, has caused an environmental footprint and has had an influence on climate change, affecting people everywhere. I am aware of these issues and strive to work towards developing a fairer society. We ask that you all take a moment to pause and reflect during this time. Good afternoon again. My name is Trishala Casey Khatri. I use the pronouns she, her, and I am a second year full-time MBA student at Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. Having a technical background, I aim to leverage my analytical skills, hungry mind for innovation, and pursuit for excellence to have an impactful marketing strategy decision career. Ultimately, leading teams to success is my goal post MBA. Growing up in Nepal, I was blessed with the opportunity to experience the beauty of the country and its people. However, I saw the disparities between men and women in terms of education and career opportunities. I also observed the lingering effects of the caste system, where people's social status was determined by their family's caste. Although the caste system had been outlawed, it was still practiced in many parts of the countries, particularly in rural areas. I came to the US with the dream of becoming a woman leader and inspiring others and turning this dream into a reality. As a kid, I always used to wonder, why can't we all be equal? Thus, I am deeply invested in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging DEIB initiatives because these help to create an environment where everyone can thrive. And that is something that is very important to me. They ensure that everyone is given equal opportunity regardless of their gender, race, ethnicity, social economic status, or other factors. Diversity encourages having people from different backgrounds. And through inclusion, we can actively engage with that diversity and promote equity. Belonging is the feeling of being respected and accepted, having a sense of community and having the opportunity to contribute and participate. I truly believe that by promoting DEIB, we can create a more equitable society where everyone can feel valued and respected, not just for the society, but creating a safe environment and inclusive workplace is essential to any organization's success as well. When I was planning to pursue my MBA, I had multiple options to choose from. Johns Hopkins is undoubtedly one of the top universities in the world. The brand name, excellent curriculum, high ranking, amazing professors were some of the factors I considered. But one of the major reasons why I joined Carey Business School is because of his commitment to equity and equality in this nation. Businesses and business schools have a significant role to play in achieving equity in America. Business education can be vital to promote economic development and address inequities that exist in businesses. I was persuaded by Carey's commitment in closely examining and reimagining their culture, content, and collaboration for building a diverse and inclusive ecosystem. Carey has a very strong DEIB ecosystem, the Council for Equity and Belonging, the Underrepresented Groups Advisory Board, many student affinity groups, and this annual DEIB Summit. At Carey, these aren't just initiatives or task forces, but diversity and inclusion is baked into everything they do. And I always feel that I belong here. When I came to the orientation, among 90 students in the cohort, there were people from 30 plus different countries. In fact, for academic year 2022 to 2023, we have students from 78 different countries, including the US, across all programs in Carey. Well, I never experienced this much diversity, and here we have all the people from the world at Carey. Carey has always given me the opportunity to learn from my diverse class, staff, faculty, and strive towards becoming an inclusive leader. I love to travel to different places, and I'm always looking for ways to connect to different people from different cultural backgrounds. Because of Carey, I have been able to make those connections and polish my cultural agility. This summit is a great opportunity to engage with and learn from leaders across industries who are deeply committed to the principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. We will provide skill building, dialogue, reflection that will help us understand why this work is so important and how can we be better advocates for it. We will also use this time to critique system inequities and work together to build equity-minded practices. We are looking forward to a meaningful and enriching summit and can't wait to see the fruitful conversations and collaborations that will come out of it. Our summit is for 3 days, and I want to give you a run through of all the sessions. Today, we are starting with a fireside chat on understanding belonging in educational environment, followed by a lunch at 1 p.m. From 5 to 6 p.m. today, we have an in-person, The Power of You, Creating a Culture of Belonging. For tomorrow, we have a panel discussion in Zoom focused on women in leadership from 12 to 1 p.m. Then from 2 to 3, we have another Zoom panel discussion on ERGs and affinity-based organizations in the healthcare space. This is followed by another Zoom webinar talk on professional identity development for Black women from 5 to 6 p.m. Finally, on Friday, we have a Zoom webinar on ERG sponsorship, building trust and leadership business from 12 to 1 p.m. We conclude with an in-person workshop on developing an inclusive mentoring culture from 3 to 4:15 p.m. We close out this wonderful summit with an in-person reception from 4:30 to 6 p.m. in the Pasano lobby on the second floor. The details for all these schedules and registrations are given in our DEIB Summit website, so we kindly request you to register for these sessions if you have not already done so. So, without further ado, to kick off our summit, we are starting with a fireside chat on understanding belonging in educational environment with Dr. Sacha Sharp and Dean Alex Triantis. Dr. Sharp is an education specialist and assistant professor of medicine and adjunct assistant professor in the program of Africana Studies at IUPUI. Dr. Sharp is also the co-chair of IU School of Medicine Diversity Council. As an education specialist, she serves medical students, residents, and fellows through educational success initiatives. She also has expertise in curricular development, program management, and evaluation. Dr. Sharp's research interests include the experiences of Black women in professional education, identity expression via social media modalities, culturally engaging andragogy, and health equity for members for the African diaspora. Dr. Sharp earned her PhD at IU Bloomington with a higher education focus in the Department of Education, Leadership and Policy Studies. She also earned a master's in education and human development from the George Washington University. Dr. Sharp is a Dexter Fellow with the Department of Medicine, as well as recipient of the 2022 IU Building Bridges Award for her work in diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. So let us all welcome Dr. Sacha Sharp and Dean Alex Triantis.
So much, Trishala, for that wonderful introduction. That was great to hear. And Dr. Sharp, it's wonderful to have you here with us today, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. We will open up for questions from the room as well as the Zoom as well. So think about questions you'd like to ask Dr. Sharp, and I will get us started here. So as you heard, the theme of this summit is belonging in action, and we talk about DEIB at the Carey Business School. Many places focus on DEI. So that B is what we're here to talk in a lot greater depth here in terms of what does it really mean to create a sense of belonging, and how do we do that in action? So that seems like a natural starting point is for us to kind of settle up a little bit on a definition of belonging and try to make everyone comfortable with what that means, a sense of belonging.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Very excited to talk about these concepts, and I know that our intro speaker actually shared a little bit about what belonging means, and I think there's several definitions. So when I was thinking about this, and I've been digesting this topic for some time now in preparation for this talk, I did a little bit of a literature search because that's my nature to do that, and so I realized that this is a concept, belonging or sense of belonging is a concept that actually was initiated in the 60s, but it wasn't necessarily brought into being measured, right? So they kind of talked about it, but there weren't really measurements for it until around 1992. Haggerty and colleagues kind of presented this concept in a psychological capacity, right? Talking about what is necessary for individuals to feel like they belong, because they found that it was really essential for health and well-being and mental wellness in order to belong. Feeling integral to a particular organization, feeling that you align with it in your social kind of characteristics and understanding, or your identity. Those were essential to the components of belonging. And it wasn't until 1992, I believe it's Hausman and colleagues, this is 2009, that they brought it into an educational capacity, right? So we were talking about it in psychology, but we thought about it then in the 2000s. What does it mean in a classroom setting? How do we get our students to feel like they belong in the classroom? And so that is when we see that introduction to education science, and different models were brought forth on how we can measure it. And so this is something that's been in existence for a long time, but I think there's some renewed energy around belonging, especially with some of the things that we're going through culturally, to make sure that individuals feel like they belong to a particular space, feel affirmed by that space, validated by that space, and as if that space, that environment is essential to their identity.
Wonderful introduction, and a few things I'd like to pull out of that. One is we are focused here at Carey Business School on the work environment, but also, as you point out, obviously we're very focused on the learning environment as well. So maybe we'll differentiate those. But you talk about sort of this psychological health and well-being. Are there also I also think about it in terms of the ability to learn, the ability to perform. So when you feel that sense of comfort and empowerment, that it allows you to succeed in other ways beyond just sort of your mental and physical health. I'm just curious if you have thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, definitely. And so it goes back into this psychological component of being well. And if we think about it in a classroom environment, I have examples of faculty when I was doing my PhD program that made sure I felt like I belonged by checking in and making sure I was well at the start of a particular class, right? And so what is your mental state? What is your well-being? Understand that people bring their full selves to particular environments, and they decide, I do a little bit of impression management kind of research, they decide which aspects of themselves they can pull to the front space depending on how the environment reacts. right? And so if the environment does not welcome them in a way for them to be fully authentic, they may have to restrain some components of their identity. And so when we're thinking about wellness and belonging, we want to mitigate these situations where an individual feels they can't bring their full selves to a particular space, especially educational spaces. Because back to the psychological component, we're not being well if we can't be fully ourselves, right? And so you can't be successful if you are doubting that folks will welcome you or that you belong to a particular environment.
And it's particularly, I mean, we've got to call out very early in this discussion, I think, the fact that educational institutions for decades, right, were not inclusive at all, let alone really fostering a sense of belonging. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about sort of the institutional factors that sort of underlie why this is an issue that we need to focus on in terms of ensuring that everybody has that sense of belonging.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of work that institutions have to do to mitigate the barriers that exist in order to allow everyone to belong. And so, as was stated in the land acknowledgement, we understand that institutions were built on the backs of Black and brown individuals, indigenous folks, and yet they weren't accepted into these institutions. And so there is a geohistorical component to our education practice that we need to acknowledge. And we need to think about decolonizing how we approach concepts like belonging and education in order to serve those populations. I also was thinking about this earlier. I think about how Black and brown folks, indigenous folks, I think about women, I think about parents, have been able to navigate these systems that don't want them there, that they don't necessarily belong to, regardless of those belonging components. And that's very interesting to me, right? We've been able to navigate these systems without necessarily belonging, or when there were barriers to belonging that were very evident. So now when we approach belonging, I really think about maybe we should allow folks that didn't necessarily have that challenge of learning how to belong to really reflect, while we are very specific and direct to those individuals that we know haven't belonged in a very long time, right? So thinking about how are we approaching a woman's belonging, knowing that there was a time where they didn't belong and they had to fight for it and they had to overcome certain barriers. I also think about parents. As I'm a parent, how do we think about parents' belonging? Do we have spaces for them? Do we have policies for them? How do we think about Black and brown or minoritized individuals and their belonging? Are we centering them in the conversation? Are we asking them about their experiences? So all of those things are important in order to decolonize, and also asking them in ways, or centering their histories in ways that they can now feel as if they belong when for so long they didn't.
So as part of that, I think you're recognizing or calling out the fact that we want everybody to belong, right? But we have to pay particular attention to a variety of different groups who feel like who may have a sense of a lower sense of belonging, right? So how does, practically speaking, then, you gave a great example before about in a classroom, right, of coming up to somebody ahead of time. Yeah. So part of this is for the faculty to maybe take particular actions, but even more so when I've seen cases where maybe someone did not feel that sense of belonging, it was because of peers as well. So it's kind of managing directly, but also managing, as you said, with everybody else being sort of an ally in that as well. Yeah. So any other piece of advice in terms of how one would do that in the classroom?
Yes, I was thinking about the classroom space. I do a lot of research. It's shared on culturally engaging pedagogical or andragogical practices. And this is a topic that I've been wrestling with and grappling with several of my colleagues, because there's a lot of materials that exist in terms of this concept. You can think about culturally engaging, culturally relevant, culturally responsive, culturally sustaining. I know all of this because I've been steeped into this research a lot. And I am working on a paper I've been working on for 4 years. And so, we're trying to figure out where is the conversation, because all of these concepts already exist, from Latson Billings and Gay and all of these folks, Paris, who wrote Culturally Sustaining Practices. And we don't want to disrupt any of those things that already exist, but something seems to still be missing in terms of how we're approaching it, if it's still coming up as a part of the conversation. So I think about the individuals in that space, and maybe some resource barriers if we're thinking about a faculty and their practice of how can we really engage in this work, and what are the barriers that present themselves. I also think about the reverse. So I'm thinking from a minoritized faculty standpoint, and oftentimes I'm in classroom spaces where students don't believe that I'm faculty, and they're shocked by me having a PhD, right? And so how can I create a space of belonging for my students if I don't even feel like I belong as faculty? So there are things from the faculty angle that are necessary in order to approach this topic, thinking about how they engage with students, how often they're able to interact with particular students, and the resources they may need to do this work. But then there's also that side from the student. A student needs to feel empowered in a particular classroom, validated by the curriculum, see themselves presented in the curriculum, given space in order to process, but also feeling as if the faculty member is someone that is in support of their educational attainment. And that all starts with a faculty member's philosophy, educational philosophy, and the characteristics they bring with them to the space. And then, too, they have to have the members of the class that are also present, and create space for that engagement and validation, because that's sometimes a barrier, too. You have those particular individuals in the class that maybe don't want to acknowledge certain things or don't agree. And so it's usually the faculty's job to set some rules at the start of a course and say, like, this is a validating space. Should be a psychologically safe space for us to engage in this content. This is what we're going to talk about. You know up front, and you can decide now whether you want to engage or not. And if you don't, I want to give you a space to discuss why, but also know that I'm here to challenge you and raise your critical consciousness in these educational environments. I'm not here to pacify students, because I'm the educator, and I went to school for this, to be able to do this, right? And so acknowledge that in my belonging, that I deserve to be here.
So, and it makes me think of, in terms of seeing yourself in the curriculum, that one of the things we talk a lot about in business schools is that we do a lot of cases, whether they're cases that are, published by Harvard Business School, or whether or not they're real live cases, right, of a company. And oftentimes in those cases, the protagonists, the CEO or CFO, whatever, are not like a lot of people in the room, right? And so there's a lot of focus on sort of how to find examples that others can see themselves in.
Make them up. We do a lot of case-based education in medicine as well, and I actually lead a session on hidden curriculum and professionalism, where I ask medical students, residents particularly, to reflect on what professionalism means and how does it look across different demographics of people. And so I've had to take cases that were not fictitious in order to give them a sense of, like, what if this happens? Or I'll take cases from the news or something like that in order to make sure folks feel like they're represented in the curriculum, but we're also getting at the particular topic at hand.
That makes good sense, but even more so if we can find true live cases that we can pull in of hopefully more corporate CEOs who are of color and women and so on. So you mentioned before that starting, I think you said in the early 90s, mm-hmm. that there started to be literature on how you measure belonging, yes. right? And I imagine some of that in the psychology literature may be beyond some of us, but I don't know if you can share some of that, because ultimately, if we're really going to focus on this, we want to be able to measure it well. And I think people have a sense when there is a lack of belonging, right? Those are the cases that we hear about and talk about. But at the same time, we'd love to have a measure that we're getting better and better, as opposed to just, hearing fewer and fewer conflicts in the classroom or whatever the case may be. So help us out thinking through that measure.
Yeah, I mean, there I think are some informal components to where we can measure belonging, thinking about who is present in the room, or who, if we're in Zoom environments, who wants to show their face and who doesn't. Thinking about, are folks wearing swag? Do they feel that's a sense of identity associated with them? If they're, if we're talking about the Carey Business School, do folks wear that particular swag or use that, the mugs and things like that, right? There are some informal ways of thinking about environment. Quantitatively too, you can think about belonging and inclusion in terms of just counting the faces that you see, the types of faces and the diversity in the space. There are quantitative measures that you can think about too. There are sense of belonging measurement tools that exist that a lot of departments use and send to faculty, staff, and students. If you're thinking about evaluation, you can think about that in terms of too, just like events like these. Are we sending out some sort of program evaluation tool at the end to measure satisfaction and to get a sense of, what folks are feeling, and did that increase any sense of belongings or lower? We also, on the reverse, I know you said not to be necessarily negative, but we also have mistreatment kind of surveys that we present at our school to measure, like, do you feel mistreated? Do you feel harassed in particular environments? Because we know that's antithetical to belonging. And so we want to see our numbers go down in those realms. So those are just a few ways. I also think there's a wellness index that we use as an institution to just see if folks are well, and we're creating more spaces for wellness. Because as the psychological definition presented, wellness is a large component of this belonging piece. And so I think there's a lot of instruments that already exist that could be implemented. But you could also just ask some folks and really check in with your faculty and create spaces with your students to see if they belong or feel it.
The old double check-in. You ask the question twice, right? Like, how are you feeling? How are you doing? Then you say, no, really, how are you doing?
Yeah. I mean, I've created spaces too that are not necessarily academic for folks to come to be able to just vent and express themselves. Yeah. Because sometimes when you feel like there's a requirement to be your best self and academic, and I need to know everything, that is kind of a code switch that disallows being, vulnerable and authentic in a particular space. So just letting folks know, like, this is a space created for you to just be you and to chat. We have one in Zoom. We do little cocktail hours with faculty and different things like that, and that seeing who shows up. That is really helpful in getting a sense of, folks feel like they belong to these spaces enough to come to these events that don't have any requirements attached to them.
By the way, if you can give me 1 minute for a shameless plug about our own belonging measurement tool that Johns Hopkins just put out, an assessment for living, working, and learning. Which involves a lot of questions about belonging. So if you have not filled that out yet, please, everybody, fill it out, because it's really our best way of us trying to measure that in different settings. So you talked a little bit before about allyship, and again, for those that may not be able to advocate for themselves fully in terms of wanting to feel that sense of belonging, how others can help in various ways. I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit more on sort of how to be a great ally.
Yes. So allyship is more than just relationship, having a strong relationship with someone. Allyship is really tied to understanding some of the geohistorical, political, and some of the critical components of someone's existence, and being able to speak up for those individuals when you see there's a need to speak up. And so I shared with Roger, I think earlier, or yesterday, I have an ally that is a white woman that is in spaces with me at work. And I know that if she's in the room, I can relax. I can do some self-preservation, because oftentimes as a Black woman, when I hear things happen or I disagree or I think it's not inclusive, I feel like I'm usually the only person there, and I have to speak up to those particular things. But I don't want to do that all the time. And I want to preserve my own energy, because doing that all the time is really taxing and stressful. And so I know I have this ally in someone that doesn't share the same race as me, but is always willing to speak up to these issues, and call folks out and bring folks in when they need to be brought in. And so seeing that person there lets me relax. And so thinking maybe you don't necessarily experience the same things that other folks experience, minoritized experiences, womanhood, different things like that. But learning more about those and creating a space where you can speak up to that. And I don't encourage you to just leave here today and then start speaking up. It takes a little bit of work to learn some of the things. You don't want to be that person that's just saying stuff and you're like, what are they talking about? You have to, you're not an ally just because you do this work. You have to be identified as an ally, right? Someone has to thank you and be willing to work with you and tell you that the work that you're doing is really meaningful to me, and I think of you as an ally. And so, not everyone can just be it. It's really about your actions, and you need folks from those groups to help affirm that allyship is working.
Great. So I want to go back into the classroom a little bit, and there's often an issue where faculty will call on people that may be like them, look like them, same culture as them, and so on. And so others feel like they're not invited as much into the discussion. Mm-hmm. Now, some students, maybe some here, feel perfectly comfortable not getting called on all the time, right? So there's often sort of that tension of, do I call on people or do I not? But any thoughts in terms of, should a faculty member really make a special effort to call on people who may not feel as comfortable, may not feel that sense of belonging, to be able to speak openly in a conversation?
Yes. So my answer is going to be a little bit different in terms of, if you find that you're creating this environment that maybe you don't want to create by calling on individuals, then I usually do a practice where I just wait for someone to chime in, and I am very comfortable with awkward silences, and I tell them that up front. So I'm not going to call on you, but I do have an expectation, and it's set in my syllabus, that everyone must participate. And I'm accounting for how often folks participate. And so I'm not calling on you, but if I notice that you haven't spoken in a long time, I'm documenting that, right? And so that can prevent the situation of, who am I calling on? You can also create some structure around your curriculum to say, like, I want you all to present on a particular topic. And so we're doing this curriculum, and we're studying a particular thing. You're going to be the facilitator, so please sign up for facilitation around whatever topic you choose, and you can bring whatever components from the literature or whatever to that topic that feel important to you, and that way we can learn about each other a little bit better in a different way, rather than me doing the calling on you and making things awkward, and I didn't call on this individual enough. So just maybe a different approach.
Great. Well, I wanted to leave some time for questions from the audience. So if you have one. And is somebody monitoring the Zoom room? Yes. Thank you, Meredith. Let me know if something comes up. I will. Yes, Stephen.
You should have a microphone, I think, on your table as well. Oh, okay.
It's the gooseneck one in the middle, I think. Oh, you don't have one? Okay.
Hi, Dr. Sharp. I'm Stephen Cohen. I'm a professor here at Carey Business School in Business Communication. I have to say, first off, I've heard a number of these discussions, and you were fantastic.
Thank you,
Alex, can we please recruit her here? And I would love to have you as a colleague, first of all. Let me just say that. But to that end, I feel like sometimes there are a lot of these forums where we talk a lot about DEIB, but sometimes the action is lagging. And I wonder, from your perspective, what does it take to break through? What does it take to really move the needle, especially in a place like Carey? We care about DEIB.
Yes.
But it's hard. It's just it's difficult for a whole host of reasons. And I'm wondering, from your research, from your experience, what are the critical levers? What does it take to break through, move the needle on belonging, and make people show up here every day and feel like, I belong. This is a place where I want to be. Carey cares about me, and the people here care about me.
Okay, that's a really tough question. I think there's a lot of factors that are involved to thinking about action toward belonging and making sure it happens. And I don't think that we're ever going to be 100% at that stage with DEI in general. A lot of things are happening societally, politically, and all of these things that stand in the way, that act as barriers. And I have to be realistic. Institutions have certain people that they have to answer to. That create situations where some of these practices can't be fully committed or engaged. So I just want to acknowledge that. And then I also think from a leadership standpoint, we have to think about who is the belonging for. So there are certain metrics that individuals and institutions and different people have to meet. And so me as faculty may be like, we're not doing belonging in the way that we need to be doing it, and I don't understand. But at a leadership level, the belonging piece may be geared toward recruitment, particularly, right? How many minoritized or underrepresented individuals we're bringing in. And so we put all of our eggs in that particular basket, and we're bringing in the people, and we're doing it right in terms of that metric. But we haven't done the retention thing yet. And so there are so many factors, again, that just make this challenging. And I think, too, as a society, right, because a lot of these things that are standing in the way of belonging, diversity, equity, they are institutionalized and ingrained into the facets of how we interact as a society. And there are always going to be these things that crop up that try to challenge it. We know the environment we live in today. And so there are people in power that create policies that make this very difficult to pursue. And so I don't necessarily, I come from a critical race theory kind of background. So I don't think that these things will necessarily end because of what is institutionalized in our culture. But progress forward and continuing to be optimistic and doing this work is still pretty important.
I'm kind of, sorry, no, I should be offer it up. I'll come back later, please.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Momo Conte, and I'm HR Director for a state agency.
I'm so sorry. Could you be closer? Yeah, we'll do that. That may be easier. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, hello.
That's great. Yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon again. My name is Momo Conte. I'm HR Director for a state agency. The piece belonging, a lot of organizations stop at diversity, equity, and inclusion. Do you see the belonging piece being added to diversity work in the future?
So there's tons of variations of this, right? So at my institution, we do diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, not necessarily belonging, because some folks may believe that the inclusion piece just assumes that there's belonging when it doesn't. So I think that there are various terms and language for the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion that we need to pursue, and that a lot of institutions are thinking about. When we think about policies and decisions, I think that's where a lot of this is rooted, and what directions we want to go with the particular policies and those decisions that we're making, and so why are we wanting folks to feel as a part of a particular institution, or is it our institutional culture that folks feel like they're a part of it? That's why that belonging piece may come in. We have justice because we're thinking about just our health. We're in medical school, so we're thinking about the health of Indiana and particular communities, and we're seeing a lot of health disparities in a lot of different populations. And so because of the direction of leadership and the direction that our school mission is going in, that's why we choose justice. And so, I mean, I think that there's tons of variation, and I don't think that we're losing belonging because we emphasize a particular word. I just think, you know, it's just based on your mission. You had a question.
Well, you referenced in answer to the previous question about, you know, we often have folks that we have to report to and that there's issues there. And I feel very fortunate that within Hopkins, everybody is aligned on this, and with our board of trustees, and we're a private university in a state that is supportive and progressive. But you may not have that same support, and certainly in other states, it's becoming very, very hostile. I don't know if hostile to the word belonging yet, certainly to DEI, so maybe that will survive somehow. But I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on how do all the institutions facing those challenges actually be able to accomplish what we're talking about today?
Yes, and it's funny. So I had this conversation because we are facing these challenges in Indiana, and we have individuals particularly that do not want us to have these types of offices. They don't want us to do any kind of diversity trainings. They're trying to ban all of that. And so we have to think strategically about our language around particular sessions that we're offering. And I thought it was interesting because I think diversity, equity, inclusion is not necessarily our like as a minoritized individual, those are not the words I don't think I would necessarily put to the topics that we're having. Diversity came about, I think, because folks were like, okay, I know you mean diversity of race maybe or ethnicity, but there's also diversity of thought, and there's also all these other things that we can be included in diversity, right? And it was very a palpable word, and I think equity for all too is very palpable. And so it's very interesting now that folks are like, no, we don't want any of that in our training either. And so it's constantly the semantics that we have to navigate in terms of just doing this work. And it's like, we could just call this togetherness if you want, or a luncheon. And we could still do this work, right? And we can still make sure folks belong, and we are being attentive, and we bring everybody to the table and are inclusive. And so that's kind of how we're approaching some of the things at our school, thinking of like, how do we continue to do this work and maintain our funding, but don't say things or do things that are on the radars of particular individuals.
Hopefully the word togetherness will not get banned.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Sharp, for sharing such wisdom today. You talked about showing up as your authentic self. So my question surrounds like ERG groups and student orgs. When you think about them, you have opportunity to connect with folks that share an identity with you. It also encompasses a lot of additional work outside of your typical job responsibilities. That generally focus on making an impact in the community and in the workplace. While there's so much value in having these identity-based groups, what does equity look like when it comes to, or when it appears that minority groups have to work a little harder to feel like they belong in a space? Maybe from like an employer lens and also from an advocacy fatigue lens.
Yes, I'm gonna actually use a particular example for this one. Because I went to a conference, it's a medicine conference that we had, and 2 students were presenting, medical students, and they had created this whole recruitment strategy for underrepresented folks in medicine. And the school were like in full support, and they had a faculty advisor, but these medical students were doing it for free. And I brought forth, I was like, you know, what are you doing for compensation? Like, how are you being compensated for being facilitators of diversity at your institution? They were not the appropriate people to ask that question, of course, but their leadership was not there for me to challenge them. And I usually do this in spaces where I see medical students or any students that are leading charges, because we understand that students are transient. They're not going to be at our institutions forever. And so when we lean on them heavily to do this work, that means that it probably will go away when those student leaders go away. And then we have to restart that whole process. So we can't lean on them in order to make anything in terms of change happen. We can have them be engaged in those processes, but they should not be doing it. If you are in a situation when you are doing it, though, I would say we need to think as leaders, but we also need to advocate for ourselves as students to say, I need something in return. How can you pour back into me as someone that is investing in your institution's DEIB work? Are you writing me letters? Are you networking and sponsoring me on behalf of my future? What are other ways that you can pour in that may not necessarily be compensation, even though I'm all for scholarships and grants. So if you got folks doing this work and it's really meaningful and you're calling it out and you're saying, oh, this is so great, look at our affinity groups, they've done this and they led this. Is there a grant that we can find for this affinity group? Are there scholarships we can find for these members? But also, am I writing the letters that I could be writing or doing the work for their future as well? Because if we are being equitable and we all want this work to happen, it needs to fit into the bottom line as well.
You can use the mic on.
Hi, my name is Jaden Nixon. I'm a first year here at Carey. I'm part of the Hopkins Business Health Initiative, and I'm currently doing research on cultural competency in medicine. And I was wondering, are there ways to show the cultural, societal, and even monetary benefits of having diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? And you can show that to individuals that may not want to see the benefits of it, or maybe just can't see the benefits of it. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, like any actionable solutions for that.
Yeah, okay, we're thinking about it in the healthcare. I mean, it really is impactful in my state, right? Because there are so many health disparities or inequities. It's like, I like to talk about it, and I do health equity work and talking about the measurements of how this work is beneficial to everyone. But monetarily, I think, so every physician has to put in codes and things like that for insurers when we're thinking about serving patients. And I recently heard that there is this thing called Z codes where it's talking about social determinants of health. And so if a particular determinant of health is impacting an individual, they can put in a code for it. And it helps with billing processes, and they're measuring that monetarily. So some of that work is already being done in order to think about the ways that we can measure and see the broader impact of doing this diversity work. But ultimately, that's another piece. It was to your question before about like, what are we doing when the state and legislators kind of coming down on us? We've seen at IU that doing the diversity work has uplifted everyone. In terms of our graduation rates, we have a high match rate into residency. It's funny because some news channels like to claim that this work is not necessary and it's hindering the success of other people, but it's shown in our data. Like residency programs want our students. They want folks that are competent in these areas and able to work in diverse hospital settings or business settings. And so the proof is there. You just have to want to look for it.
We have a question online. Any advice for those that are part of these marginalized groups and are also fighting daily for change, how to deal with fatigue and burnout?
Yes. Fully pour into preservation. It is okay to not be the one speaking up to everything. And that is a resistance strategy. So my dissertation was about social media particularly, and the resistance strategy folks use in social media environments and healing strategies. And to not do can be just as effective as doing. When you are able to identify components of burnout and things like that in yourself, which is really a struggle, because I think burnout shows up differently for different people. Sometimes you can tell it mentally, sometimes it's physical, where you think you're okay, but your body is telling you that you're not okay. And so self-preservation is one piece to that. But I also finding social environments where you can be your authentic self. And I got to shout out my crew. So I have 2 women that I did my dissertation with, and we met weekly since our qualifying exams, which were like in 2019, and we still meet weekly to just affirm each other, pour into each other. We're in different places now, but we talk about the things that we're going through and how to navigate, and we call it our sister circle. And that is a space of belonging that I've created for myself and we've created for one another. And so I encourage folks that feel like they're burning out to find those spaces of belonging. Maybe they're not in your environment, maybe they're outside of, and maybe you can convince your environment to pull them in and legitimize them if you wish. But those have been really helpful for my success and me avoiding burnout. And it could even be virtual. I have my little text message chain, and I always text them if something is happening. I'm like, oh my goodness, I don't have a person in this space to talk to about it, but I can text them, and they always can empathize and know exactly what's going on. And so that's been helpful for me.
Hi, Dr. Sharp. Thanks for being here today. My name is Philip Bakerman. I'm on the alumni relations team here at Carey, and I really appreciate your bringing up the topic of allyship. Full disclosure, I'm a white dude,
Yes.
but
thank you for disclosing.
yes,
Not many people today.
I wanted to make sure you were aware. But I manage mentoring programs for our Black alumni network and for our women's alumni network. We recently just launched a Pride alumni network, and I consider myself an ally in these spaces. But to your point, it's a two-way street. Mm-hmm. So can you give us 1 or 2 different personal characteristics that we should look at from the personal level where we can identify ourselves as an ally, become a strong ally, and continue to grow in this space?
Yeah. Firstly, your disclosure of being a white man, I appreciate it. I actually have done this in some of my identity development courses where I have every student identify themselves, because most students have not ever said that they were white in public. And so I think that that's great. Thank you for doing that. Again, you can't necessarily identify yourself as an ally. You have to be told that you're an ally. And so in characteristics that I seek out are people that are knowledgeable and well-informed, and they didn't ask me about it. They didn't ask for a sit down to say, tell me what I should be saying or what I should be doing. They've done their own work and the research, and when they speak, they know it, and it's clear. Right, that this is something very meaningful to them, and they truly want to understand the phenomenon or the condition of being minoritized and ways to effectively change that and mitigate any barriers. And so when I find them in those spaces and they're speaking truth, and I just want to snap. And I may not have never talked to them. I didn't coach them into doing this. This is just purely and genuinely who they are. That is who I identify as allies. Or to know when to not center themselves in the conversation. And so it could be as simple as, hey, we've talked a lot on this issue about this particular demographic, but what about some of the other folks? What about some of the other minoritized groups? Even if those people are not present in the room, are you bringing them up, right? So we're having talks about inclusion, and maybe there are no parents in the room, but you bring it up. You're like, hey, we didn't think about lactation rooms, or we didn't think about these other things that folks that are not represented may need. Those are some markers of what allyship means.
I think we have time for one more question, and this question comes from online. How do you identify or address feelings in the workplace, and do we share it with coworkers?
It depends on the feelings, I guess. Hopefully, in these types of work environments, you have mentorships. I think there's going to be a session about mentorship, sponsorships, things like that. So when I think of mentors, I think of a network. It's not of one person. Okay, there should be multiple people in your mentorship network. There's someone that is thinking about your career ambitions. There's someone that is sponsoring you, dropping your name every time an initiative comes forth. There's someone in mind, because I have to do writing and stuff, someone that's reading my publications and helping me prep them for publication or whatever journal. And then there's somebody that's an emotional mentor as well. Somebody that I can talk to when I have particular feelings that I need to express. It may just be funny. I may see an email come through and I'm like, what in the world? And I know exactly that person that I can email that will commiserate with me and say, I don't know what's going on. But they may also be in a position of leadership to say, actually, I don't know what's going on, but I'm going to check to see what's going on, because this doesn't make sense. And so think about the mentorship network. Think about you can Google, there are these maps, networking maps that you can create. I hope I'm not taking away from the session later. But think about the people that you would place in those nodes of your map. And is there a person that you can go to? And they may be external to your institution. I would hope not, but they may be. And that's okay too, just to know that I do have people within my institution that can help me and mentor me for particular things, but I also have some folks external as well.
Great. Well, I mentioned from Roger your comment that I got to wrap up here. So, Dr. Sharp, I want to thank you for making the time to be here in person and the great insights that you've shared with us today, and setting us up, as you said, for the rest, all the other sessions here over the next 2-3 days. So, thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me.